Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ines Katzenstein. I'm a curator of Latin American art, director of the Cisneros Institute at MoMA, as well as the group leader for the Latin American research that takes place at the museum as part of the Contemporary and Modern Art Perspective programs. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth and final session of Transversal Orientation, a seminar series that is devoted to interrogating art through dialogues extending across borders, positions, aesthetic traditions, and ideologies. These discussions have unfolded across the 4 sessions of the seminar, which has examined the transversal in its temporal and geographic dimensions through the work of artists who are working from Mexico City, Brooklyn, Tallinn, Vilnius, London, Wellington, Stuttgart, and Chicago, and through the narration of histories of transnational exchange and violence by scholars and writers. This seminar series is organized by Wang Bing Gao, Inga Lasai, Nancy Dantas, and Madeline Murphy Turner, the 4 brilliant CMAP fellows, each of whom conducts research in a different geographical area: Southeast Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, Africa, and Latin America, respectively. To all of you, congratulations for the last 3 days of amazing ideas and exchanges. I would like to thank Jay Levinson, director of the international program at MoMA, for leading the realization of this important seminar series every year, a seminar that is important for our audience as it is for us working at MoMA. I also would like to thank Nene Diallo and Marta Dancy, also from the international program, and our AV team for the work and support. With today's panel, titled The Politics of Position, we will explore a cartography of situated and at the same time open art histories in a world where the symbolic dominance of the regime based on metropolitan centers is in crisis, and where the particularities of the local and the histories of place are gaining narrative and representational force. While an opportunity for engaging with multiple distant histories seems to be on the horizon as never before, we must also recognize the profundization of global economical disparities and therefore the risk of being deceived by a seemingly growing plurality in the world of art. The politics of position also wants to interrogate the dilemmas of who is and who's not authorized to talk about specific histories. The dichotomy between either talking from within or talking from abroad seems to be especially harsh when it concerns territories that have suffered from traumatic diasporic histories. This debate also converges with the emergence of racialized and gender voices that have been historically and violently excluded from discourse and are actively contesting privileged modes of enunciation. A discussion around the topic of the local also implies addressing different traditions of narrating arts and cultures. And these bring us to the very important question regarding transversal exchanges: how to encourage horizontal interactions among different styles of storytelling and art historical writing in a world that seems to be so emphatically dominated by the single standard of the university systems of the North. As an Argentine working at MoMA, I share with many colleagues contributing to these and other transnationally focused museums the immense challenge of translating between cultures and aesthetic systems. One of our daily purposes is to maintain active the conversation about how to create a truly plural account of the multiple worlds of art, including consensus and also dissent, in the galleries and in publications, and how to continue to question the self-perceived and performed authority of the centers. Acknowledging the limits of what can be translated and recognizing which remains adverse or resistant to cultural or linguistic translation is also part of our work as facilitators of transversal exchange. To synthesize these ideas, one of the main questions that frames this final panel is how to work towards connecting different art histories and art worlds, different temporalities and mentalities, cities and territories, in order to create an expanded transversal art history, all while nurturing a very diverse and vibrating network of artistic and intellectual exchange. Today, Jeannine Tang, Janus Sama, and Irmgard Hemmerharns will bring us their perspectives on the geopolitics of the local as they exist in the tectonic and political violence in Southeast Asia, in the histories of desire and repression in Estonia, and in a critical account of the art of memorials and collective mourning in Mexico and Colombia. Thank you to each of you for participating. With this, I will turn the screen over to Madeline Murphy-Turner, the Cisneros Institute CMAP Latin America Fellow, who will moderate today's session. Hello, Maddie.
Thank you, Inez, for that very compelling introduction. I know we're excited to discuss the points and questions you raised toward the end of the panel during the Q&A. Before I move on, I'd also like to echo Inez's thanks to our speakers, my colleagues at the museum, our audience members who are all with us here today, and the CMAP group leaders, Sean Anderson, Stuart Comer, Roxana Markoch, Smooth Nazewi, and Inez Katzenstein. I'm especially grateful to my fellow CMAP fellows, Nancy Dantas, based in Lisbon, Inga Lasse in Riga, and Wang Bing Hao in Singapore. We began organizing this series last fall by confronting head-on the challenge that we were tasked with in being representatives of entire regions that in themselves contain a multitude of languages, dialects, histories, cultures, and of course, perspectives. While CMAP fellows are normally based at the museum together, due to the ongoing pandemic and the absence of all normality, we each remained located in different parts of the world. A unique obstacle, the distance nevertheless has poetically amplified these questions of positionality that have been addressed in the preceding sessions and that we will continue to discuss today. Before I begin to introduce our first speaker, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentations, please feel free to write them in the chat. There is also live captioning available, which you can access by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I would finally like to note that the recording of today's panel, along with the previous 3 panels, will be available in the coming weeks on CMAP's online publication platform, Post Notes on Art in a Global Context, and you will find the link in the chat. I'm also happy to let you know that Rian Sares Lozano de la Pola, researcher and professor at the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas in Mexico City, will respond to today's panel via a written text that we will publish on Post in July. Thank you so much, Rian, for joining us today in the audience. And now with that, it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Jeannine Tang. Jeannine Tang is an art historian from Singapore who teaches at the New School as assistant professor of modern and contemporary art history, and she is interim director of the program in art history and visual studies. She received a 2020 Warhol Writers Grant towards a book about queer and transgender legends in contemporary art, and is also working on various projects involving Xu Liecheng, Julia Scher, profiling in the post-war period, and land art and climate change in Asia. And you will find Jeannine's full bio in the chat. Welcome, Jeannine.
Thank you so much, Madeline, and the other CMAP fellows, Bing, Inga, Nancy, as well as Jay, Nene, Nina, Chris, and Mike at MoMA for the moderation, for the organization, and Inez for moderating, and my fellow panelists, Janus and Irmgard. I'm really excited to hear your talks. Hi everyone, I'm Jeannine Tang, zooming in from Singapore, and as a visual description, I'm a woman of Chinese descent with dark hair and a pixie fade, wearing a black shirt. And today I'm going to focus on a work of art whose conceptual armature is the Asia-Pacific Rim, whose artists work simultaneously at international and planetary scales in a way that's also situated and mobile. And so to begin, I'd like to focus on the 2018 performance called Name Laundering by the artist Erwin Ahmet, who began screening news footage of a volcanic explosion at Anak Krakatoa in Indonesia. This was followed by a video shot by his collaborator Tida Salina at the Fukushima exclusion zone. This zone was created in response to a 9.0 magnitude earthquake, which caused a tsunami breaching seawalls, triggering the fuel melt of 3 nuclear reactors, whose radioactive debris penetrated deep water, leaving oceanic and atmospheric deposits remaining in the Pacific today. Even as Japan has sought to rehabilitate Fukushima and resettle its residents, an exclusion zone remains. And this was where Ahmet and Salina shot from the inside. Now, the artist typically visits such locations in order to, in Ahmet's words, read destructive traces of tsunami and observe how human ambition faces the forces of nature. In addition to witnessing, the artists typically perform an action within the Ring of Fire project. They make a ritual in a place where, quote, it's too extreme to live by humans, end quote. At Fukushima, an intensely radioactive site where open wounds are medically discouraged, Ahmet pierced his finger to produce a contaminated blood sample, a piece of evidence or trophy bagged and imaged, an object around which a story could be told in such performance lectures as Name Laundering, which forms part of a much vaster project, the Ring of Fire, which Ahmet and Salina began in 2014. The project title and geographic focus issues from the Circum-Pacific Belt, which geologists term the Ring of Fire due to the seismic activity marking the encounter of multiple tectonic plates along this perimeter. This perimeter is home to over 75% of the Earth's active volcanoes, while 90% of the world's earthquakes also occur along this belt, as the effect of plates moving and colliding, therefore releasing tensions in the Earth's crust. If climate crisis heightens the frequency and magnitude of this volcanic, earthquake, and tsunami activity, these in the longer term also contribute to the Earth's warming, wreaking devastating floods and fires upon multiple ecosystems. Adapting the work of Heather Davis, Zoe Todd, we might understand the actions of humankind as terraforming the movements of the Earth's plates, crust, and core as also necrogenic effects, live locally at the edges of plates. Casualties from earthquakes and eruptions during the early years of the 21st century have already outstripped those of the entire 20th, while cities such as Jakarta are estimated to be underwater by 2050, while climate change denialism also runs rampant in mass culture. Due to the lack of recognition for climate change in the national education system, uneven bandwidth and decentralized information across the Indonesian archipelago, information about climate impacts across the 1,000 islands remains diffuse and dispersed. Even well-connected cosmopolitan artists based in Jakarta might not know impacts to Sumatra or Papua, which can only be registered on foot, by ferry, and in person, which is to say the uneven distribution and understanding of climate emergency is not only structural and geologic, but also mediated, social and cultural. This uneven and specific cultural geology is registered by Salina and Ahmet in the Ring of Fire. Born and raised in Sumatra and Bandung, the artist grew up admiring the visual magnificence of volcanic beauty while fleeing their terrifying expulsions. Now based in Jakarta, they conceived this project in response to the interaction of tectonic and political violence. The conceptual armature of their 10-year research inquiry is an armature of slow, in-person conversations from which actions and interventions are conceived on locations around the Pacific Plate. For instance, in 2015, Salina made the 1,001st Island, a project developed in response to Indonesia as the 1,000-island archipelago. In response to the sinking of Jakarta, the Indonesian government constructed a giant seawall intended to barricade islanders from devastating tsunami. However, coastal indigenous peoples who subsist on fishing became additionally endangered, having to venture further out to sea at personal risk with increasingly uncertain catchment. It is widely doubted that walls and islands for resettling people in waste will solve the geologic emergency of a sinking capital. These are structural urban and political problems of housing, governance, and subsistence, not so easily remedied by design and construction. And so in response, Selena worked with a fishing community at the Anka estuary to catch a ton of plastic waste, the way they typically net, drag, and haul fish. The camera, flown from a drone's aerial view or submerged at object level, captures up close and above a small raft of consumer product packaging. Selena stands upon this 1,001st most sustainable island of Indonesia, her posture akin to the statues of so many colonial founders from the Dutch East Indies or East India Company. However, she doesn't appear styled as an activist or NGO worker, but is clad in skinny jeans, a t-shirt, and a black blazer. In the urban guise of a contemporary millennial artist, Selena reclines on her back and checks her phone as the island is towed through the water by a fishing boat. Navigating the perimeter of the Pacific Plate is clearly a geologic endeavor, as it is the archly posed activity of cultural cosmopolitans, hipster representatives of a global city. These explorations are pragmatic as they are picturesque, historical as they are romantic. The artists avidly document local conditions and give away their footage to climate NGOs for local campaigns. Privileging journeys on foot and public transportation by bus, train, or ship, they also solicit information not reflected in the mainstream media and remain critical of nativist and separatist politics disseminated and virally stoked on the internet's high-speed information system that also helps fuel structural violence in the region. And so although Ring of Fire is typically accessed by way of edited video reels, essay films, and the occasional live stream, the project is driven by conversation as research, or what the artists call, quote, a slow method of journey, quote, that builds, quote, deeper values of trust in every unplanned random encounter, end quote. That said, even as Ring of Fire clearly follows post-Reformasi artistic commitments to cooperation and collectivism, the politics of this project is rooted in critiques of multinational extractivism as rooted in colonial history, anarchist cooperation across classes, and values of gotong royong manifesting in practices of mutual assistance and aid. At the same time, as part of a generation of artists that Ellie Kent has observed to privilege artistic independence, Ahmed and Selena's project is also marked by conceptual actions that are autonomously authored. Each journey in Ring of Fire incorporates a performative act, a ludic action staged for the camera that conjuncts the instabilities, quote, below the Earth's plates, tectonic forces, to those of its surface, ideological forces, end quote, in the artist's words. They, quote, track the flame by marshaling their, quote, high mobility as contemporary artists to do this. Using residency and exhibitionary opportunities to travel the Pacific Plate's perimeter, their work has been described by Brigida Isabella within a generation of Indonesian-born artists whose use of travel works, quote, against the hegemonic structures that instrumentalize cultural identity as a commodity in a global art scene, end quote. Ahmed and Selena prefer to be constantly on the move, and their mobility, Isabella argues, is a, quote, displaced form of identity and a progressive diasporic practice that militates against the stabilization of national or regional identity, end quote. These travels are not the market-driven mobilities of a biennial or art fair circuit. Ahmed and Selena's sojourns are typically low budget, reliant on residencies or informally hosted. Their arrival at destinations uses what Isabella calls the network capital of friendships with other artists, academics, and curators relative to travel regulations circumscribing the movements of Indonesian citizens. At the same time, Ring of Fire is a project predicated on tectonic movement and its effect, by which rock deformations in the Earth's crust fold, fault, drift, and spread to produce geologic disruptions and atmospheric effects. And while the geologic meaning of tectonics as pertaining to the structure of the Earth's crust has been in use since the 19th century, tectonics previously stood for building fabrication, architectural construction, carpentry, and sculptural production. It is perhaps fitting then that Ahmed and Selena track the Ring of Fire's pyropolitics from rock strata to semiotic drift in order to wield, in their words, quote, a force that is often forgotten, culture. Posing as self-styled explorers, wielding sublime visuals of the Earth's geologic perimeter, the artists self-consciously parody their position. They craft epic tectonic sojourns while stymied in the act of trying to cross the border. Ahmed is routinely flagged and interrogated at every crossing into Singapore, even as the burning of Indonesian palm oil plantations permeates those borders by haze. As Ahmed put it, my forest is burning, my city is sinking, and my self-regard is hurt by state border prejudice. And so the artist performatively swore never again to enter Singapore by permissible means. He performed a sumpah, an ancient Malay oath uniting the heavens and earth at the Singaporean border at Changi Airport. In Ahmed's words, quote, "I declared my oath in the biggest airport in Asia, built on reclaimed land where the sand came from the Riau Islands through exploitation for 24 years. Unilateral expansion of territory is another form of colonialism, which triggered tensions between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore," end quote. Following his sumpah, Ahmed devised multiple methods for entering Singapore without authorization, which he enumerates in name laundering. These include passage via smuggling and piracy, cooperation with vast storms to evade detection, proposals that recall the fire of political movements and celestial air. These proposals include wielding artistic romanticism as a tactic. Here, Ahmed vows to lie for the rest of his life that he's a descendant of Raden Saleh, who gained acclaim during the mid-19th century in Amsterdam, Bergen, and Paris for hunting scenes and seascapes of ships confronting the elements. Saleh notably played the role of an exotic princely painter. Sorry, I lost my place. An exotic princely painter to artistic recognition in Europe. To emulate the self-exoticizing persona of his cosmopolitan Japanese ancestor, Ahmed styles himself as a charismatic Indonesian environmentalist, writing charismatic megafauna such as Indah, an elephant living on conservation land paid for by the oil company who destroyed her habitat. Ahmed proposes to ride Indah through the Straits of Malacca, entering Singapore via Universal Studios, a performative declaration whose fusion of high art and mass cultural Orientalism is already at play regionally when exhibition design teams for Disney produce anthropological natural history museum presentations of pre-colonial archipelagic life. When first presented, Saleh's hunting scenes and scenes of nature populated with wild animals aligned with European curiosity towards a primitive Javanese East, whose violence and cruelty were dramatically rendered at magnificent scale. His largest oil painting, Forest Fire, depicts the frantic flight of tigers, bantung, and birds from a blazing forest. Forest Fire went unexhibited for years until its 2014 sale by grandchildren of the former Dutch Queen Juliana to the National Gallery of Singapore. The sale was belatedly reported on 2 years later in 2016 when the painting went on view. This sale was criticized by the Dutch and Indonesian press. The family had neglected the canvas and its deplorable condition required significant restoration. The royal family was seen to be profiting from a loss to Dutch heritage, while the classification of the painting as private property meant that Saleh's largest painting, himself recently repositioned as Indonesia's anti-colonial hero, was not part of a hall of material culture repatriated by the Dutch to her former colony. And so in a performance stage for the camera, Ahmed and Selina viewed Forest Fire as installed at the National Gallery, posing Selina as a viewer wearing a cloth mask. She is pictured crying before the painting, hands to her face as though stifling a sob or holding her mask in place against choking haze. As Ahmed narrates in his lecture, forest fires, quote, have been a serious source of conflict between Indonesia and Singapore, while the money resulting from selling is used to acquire some Rembrandt paintings. We can see Tita's watery eyes from the smoke, as well as seeing the fate of this great painting, end quote. The romanticism of Stendhal syndrome, in which a viewer, typically a tourist, is moved to tears by art's discombobulating beauty, was reproduced here as institutional and political affect. Violent loss of geologic volume, earth and air, species and habitat is not unlinked here to the loss of heritage when governing institutions fail to protect inheritance and lineage at once animal and artistic, natural and cultural. Curators and historians Kat Dutzig and David Tay have argued that in Southeast Asia, the state meta-curates culture through funding and censorship. And in that vein, I would argue also that the state meta-curates nature-culture relations to which Ahmed and Selina's tears respond as geophysical feeling and geopolitical grief. Staging these tiers form an affective, institutional, and infrastructural critique of enduring territorial and financial stratifications that organize the stewardship of culture and earth, art, and atmosphere, while folding the international traffic on art and mobility of the artist into the planetary scale of climate crisis and its differentiated vulnerability along the Pacific Plate. The artist's critique moves at simultaneously molar and molecular registers. Ahmet's methods for unsanctioned border crossing also include the artist becoming haze, which he terms, quote, a free riding catastrophe. Money knows territory and currency, but haze and disaster don't, end quote. And so in response to the destruction of peatlands in his native Java by palm oil plantation hotspots, on March 28, 2018, Ahmet burned his hair at one such site. For this action, Ahmet checked his position via the Himawari satellite and calculated that a wind velocity of 10 knots, particles of his hair could arrive in Singapore within 16 hours. In his words, at a lecture performance timed to this action, conceptually, the smallest particle from my body has successfully arrived and been inhaled by Singaporeans, end quote. A molecular subversion of state borders, the citizen as a sovereign figure, and the human organism as an isolable body. In doing so, Ahmet relies not only on a performative act, but equally a performative declaration. In using this phrase, I refer to J.L. Austin's categorization of performative speech acts, which not only describe, but do things. For example, those pronouncements and declarations that name ships, assign guilt or innocence, and legalize marriages. Performatives don't operate along an order of truth or falsehood. Rather, they felicitously fulfill institutional power, or they implicitously resist the maintenance of sanctioned authority. Against the sovereign authority of performative acts fulfilled, Jill Cassett has argued for artistic practices engaged with decomposition and decay, these she names deformatives, by which artists doing things with being undone to survive the necropolitical order of life within the Anthropocene. Such deformative acts have founded, but might also unsettle, the tectonics of our cultures. In Restitution of 1755, Hacking Gianti, the artist questioned the treaty produced between members of the Mataram royal family that led to the cessation of North Coastal Java, Madura, and subsequently the remainder of the Mataram Kingdom to the Dutch East India Company. To this history, Ahmet produced a restitution agreement addendum, proposing to terminate the Gianti agreement altogether. Ahmet's unbinding of a treaty, his sumpa and inhalation by Singaporeans, along with Selena's inauguration of new territory and pronouncement of her grief, are but several of the numerous declarations comprising the Ring of Fire. We might understand these actions at the edges of a plate as deformative declarations upon the Earth's tectonic cultures, not declarations of independence, but declarations of vulnerability, by which molecular contagion becomes a subversively imagined community across those national borders that putatively define the air we breathe and divide our national interests. These declarations are made on location and politically situated, even as they are also culturally and tectonically mobile. They unsettle the terra firma of ongoing colonial sovereignties, deforming those neoliberal authoritarianisms whose sovereign power divides an us from a them, a wealthy elite from a majoritarian poor, those protected by seawalls and those pushed further out to sea, along with those stories told by a historian and the yarn spun by an artist, whose very voice I might well be exhaling tonight, hospitality and haze permitting. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the next talk.
Thank you so much, Jeannine, for that excellent talk. I really appreciate the way in which you convey this sense of constant movement, circulation, or shifts, both in how you narrate and through the projects that you discuss, which really rupture the idea of position as a location or stable entity. So thank you. Next, we will hear from Jaanus Sama. Jaanus is a visual artist from Estonia. His body of work includes photos, installations, and videos with topics that have been grounded in the study of urban space and the subjective experiences of it. Over the years, his interests have moved towards gender studies, investigating the representation of male sexuality. In his most recent projects, he has explored the museum as a tool for establishing authentic histories and asserting a cultural canon. In queering national heritage, he has broadened the perspectives on identity formation and offered alternative ways of contextualizing the past. In 2015, Jaanus represented Estonia at the 56th Venice Biennial, and you will find his full bio in the chat. Welcome, Jaanus. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the introduction. Share screen. I will talk about my art practice and how it has changed over the years. And I will start with my artistic research into Estonian gay history, and more specifically the exhibition Not Suitable for Work at Chairman's Tale. Then I will introduce one of my most recent projects that deals with the topic of queering national museums and history as a reconstruction. Right now, there are a number of historians who are working with Estonian queer history, and some papers have also been already published. But 10 years ago, when I started working on the topic, then very few resources were available. So inspired by curiosity, I began interviewing older gay men to learn about their lives in Soviet period, when sex between two men were punishable by law. At the beginning, I was interested in very practical things like where and how gay people met, but also what they thought at the time about being gay. In these interviews, I first heard about the notorious gay man nicknamed Chairman, who later became the interest and focus of my research. After hearing many interesting, funny, intriguing stories about this person, I went to archive to see if there were any traces of him. And I was surprised to find 10 different documents and files, and also some photographs. And most fascinating among them was a criminal case from 1966, where Chairman was prosecuted on the ground of having sexual intercourse with men, which, as already said, was criminal offense at the time. After all these discoveries, I decided to make exhibition about him because I considered it important to share his story. In the end, this exhibition became the exhibition Not Suitable for Work at Chairman's Tale, and as mentioned, this was also represented Estonia in Venice Biennial 2015. But before I walk you through this exhibition, I have to make a brief introduction about Chairman and his life. So he was born in 1920s in a poor rural family. But when World War II broke out, he was mobilized into Red Army and fought in several battles. But after the war, the Stalinist regime considered him, because of his social status and because of being war veteran, a good candidate of the position of chairman of collective farm or kolkhoz. So he made a very successful career as a chairman of several collective farms. But in 1960s, he lost his social status, job, and family because he was sentenced to 1.5 years of collective labor for homosexual activity. Later, he moved from the countryside to Tartu, which is the second biggest city in Estonia, and became quite notorious and famous in a way, even in gay circles, because of this, his active lifestyle and also maybe provocative behavior. But in 1990, he was found murdered in his apartment. Allegedly, his life was ended by one of the soldiers who had asked over for a sex, but the person responsible was never caught. Chairman interested me because his story was full of elements that in my mind were kind of crucial when we talk about gay life in Soviet period. And I found in a way even kind of his life a quintessence of Soviet gay man. And using his story as an example, I could talk about cruising in parks, prostitution, violence against sexual minorities, and of course about the paragraph 118 of criminal code that criminalized homosexuality. And this is the title of the cover of the court case. When I first came across to the court file, I was surprised about the amount of material it included. So we can see it's the really thick file that has more than 300 pages. What struck me in this case is that it is so rich of different events and perspectives. It includes doctors' observations, a blackmail letter that was found during house search, colleagues and witnesses' statements giving unexpectedly thorough insight into the sexual lives of the men involved. All in all, it's almost like pornographic or erotic novel with details about foreplays and positions in which the acts took place. And I think just to imagine and the absurdity of it, if you need this kind of file, more than 300 pages, to prove that one person had a sexual intercourse with another person, it's quite bizarre, I would say. This is the entrance of the exhibition. And I was struggling a lot how to, what to choose in this show, because it was so full of different events and stories. And so I decided to focus on the court file because I found it most shocking, and it showed also the absurdity of the system where the state was interested in someone's private life in its most intimate details. So in the first room, visitors could read actually the court file, which these are 4 copies of it. Of course, I don't expect anybody would sit and read the entire case, even though it was only 1/5 of it, but it also represented the archival aspect in my research. The second room featured archival photos of chairman and also the places he worked or his social surrounding. And I think especially in this exhibition, I was thinking of the very international audience with visitors with very different background. And I just wanted to make it kind of easier when you come and to understand where the story takes place, what it means, Kolkos in 1960s in Estonia, for example. So some photos are just to illustrate this, this surrounding. And here you can see pictures of chairman, and then also one photo on your right where you can see small Stalin and Lenin. This is actually a congress of all the chairmans in Estonia. So we can imagine somewhere there is also chairman. While these 2 rooms were more about facts, documents, and archival materials, the other part of the show was my artistic interpretation to this. So, for example, here in front you see a showcase. It was displayed in the showcase. I was showing different objects that were kind of significant in the story, but also these objects were mentioned in the court file. And for example, wedding ring, lubricant 350, what he paid for a hustler, for a sex or a vodka shot. Maybe the main part of the exhibition were 4 videos, what I did together with Estonian filmmaker Marko Raat. And here we were illustrating key events that were described in the court file. So first video is 350, as mentioned, the relationship with the hustler. But it was actually quite romantic scene in a way even. While we were choosing which events to illustrate, we were thinking also that it would be understandable for wider audience. And I think when we talk about gay history, not only Estonia, but whatever countries, almost, public toilet has a significant role in it. And so therefore there is also one video about this. But it also shows where some group of the people were pushed from the society, what kind of peripheric areas. Forensic medical examination is maybe most disturbing scene. It interprets the medical examination that these men had to go through. And the final video, the trial. In this video, actors are taking different sex positions while looking in the camera. It is an illustration of situation when the accused had to describe sexual acts, exact positions. And the idea of all of these videos were actually that the audience also should not feel too comfortable at the exhibition. The videos should not only remind that it is reconstruction, but also to make visitors aware of their presence. So in a way, it's play, a performance with this voyeuristic audience. And I think maybe especially in Venice, where you have this exhibition in Palazzo with frescoes and stuff like this, and it's all so nice, I really had to think to kind of balance this this palazzo surrounding, I would say. With this research, I had to tackle also many ethical questions because it deals with contemporary history, as some of the events happened only a few decades ago. It has raised many important questions, for example, whom these stories belong to. Are they personal stories that we should not expose, or are they part of subcultural identity that is collectively shared? Although the exhibition centers on Sherman, I was never interested in him as a real person. For me, Sherman is an example of individual struggle in a system where one cannot be free. He has been key for me to get closer to understand what it meant to be gay in 1960s in Soviet Estonia. And it is important also to understand that it is not a story of just one man and not something only that happened 50 years ago, but also that it could happen again if we don't learn from history. Next project is more recent, and this is about museums. And I have lately been interested in especially national museums and how museum institutions have so much power in establishing the official version of history and identities. In museum display, everyday objects and detached pieces of history become canonical documents. The objects and narratives are often framed by norms, customs, ideals, and their cultural context. And this photo is from textile collection in Estonian National Museum, and where I was invited to do a kind of residency. And they were very open to my approach and gave me free hands to look around and see what kind of inspires me. And I was very interested in ethnographical collection. In Estonia, I feel that folk customs are often something that is very glorified, idealized, and considered as almost sacred. And all these folk traditions, it's something that you kind of shouldn't make fun of. And I found especially fascinating these old coifs from 19th century, which were covered with beautiful embroideries and very colorful patterns. But they were not just beautiful accessories. As a headwear, coifs were indicated the status of being married, and the Estonian peasant woman had to wear these coifs every day. So it's also interesting that during wedding ritual, it was very common that newly married woman was hit against the face with this coif with the word "forget your dreams and remember a man." And I mean, of course, it was meant as a joke, but I'm not sure if all the women found it funny. There's one example more. I think maybe because of Corona, since I usually work with bigger installations and I collaborate a lot with different craftsmen, then now I found myself in a situation when I had to do things that I can do myself in my small studio or even home. And I start making drawings. And I started to copy these ornaments that were used on coifs. But in the center, I decided to place different men's underwear. I was also really almost like shocked about of the colors and the patterns that I found, and it was hard to believe that these were used in some. For example, this one was Saaremaa, it's an island in Estonia. They look like patterns from some other cultures, I would say. And the idea of these drawings, I wanted to make something that would be kind of nationalistic kitsch par excellence, but on a closer look would undermine the whole idea. And a month ago, I had an exhibition with these drawings, exhibition titled Pattern in Tartu. And I was fortunate that Estonian National Museum also gave some of the original coifs from the 19th century that I could show together with these drawings. But I also produced 3 pairs of men's jockstraps that were decorated with similar motifs. And this work had maybe 2 ideas. In one hand, I wanted to shake the way we usually see these traditional folk costumes as something that will tell us about good old times without asking any serious question, what does it actually mean? And in the other hand, we can see it also as an utopian idea of historic garment that could exist in parallel world. And I was very fortunate to work with craftsman Virve Valtman-Valtson, who did these embroideries. And we were really working hand to hand, like because we had to modify it in a different shape, and it was interesting to hear her ideas. And she's more than 80-year-old and has done these embroideries whole life. So it, I learned really a lot of this process. And in this image, they are all together. To conclude with the exhibition on German, I work with creating lost history and concentrate on facts and actual life stories and experiences. But in the more recent project, however, I'm still fascinated with history, but my attention has turned toward interpreting institutional narratives and querying the preconceived ideas of the past. And I will end my presentation with this still life that is inspired of postcards from Soviet time, when it was fashionable to make compositions with different objects that carried a sense of national identity. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Janus, for sharing your fascinating work with us. I really look forward to hearing more about how you understand the relationship between the archival original and reenactment in your practice. So next, we will hear from our final speaker, who is Irmgard Emmelheinz. Irmgard is a professor, writer, researcher, and translator based in Anahuac Valley in Mexico City. Her work about film, the Palestine question, art, culture, and neoliberalism has been translated to many languages, and she has presented it at an array of international venues. Her book in Spanish, The Tyranny of Common Sense, Mexico's Neoliberal Conversion from 2016, will come out in English with SUNY Press this fall. The Sky is Incomplete, Travel Chronicles in Palestine was published by Taurus Mexico in 2017, and Jean-Luc Godard's Political Filmmaking by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. Forthcoming is her collection of essays, Toxic Loves, Impossible Futures, Feminist Lives as Resistance in Critical Mexican Studies, which will be published with Vanderbilt University Press. You will find her bio in the chat. Welcome, Irmgard. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, Ines, for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be this morning with you guys. The enlightenment values of equality, peaceful public life, access to modern sciences, rule of law, democracy, technology, and progress were the lure to expand European modernity to the rest of the world. Modernization also meant the creation of infrastructure to unify nations like communications, factories, buildings, transportation systems, and now data farms and optical fiber, how we produce and distribute food energy. This infrastructure is now completely merged with the capitalist project, endangering the present and future possibility of reproducing life on the planet. A situation that Achille Mbembe has called becoming Black of the world, by which he means necropolitics and the dispossession of the power of self-determination and exposure to waste zones, toxic atmospheres, public health emergencies, degraded water. Becoming Black means indebted and diseased bodies and the absolute commodification of the means to sustain life. Seemingly unstoppable mass migration is symptomatic of this becoming Black of the world. According to Dipesh Chakrabarty, anti-colonial leaders and thinkers like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Nasser, Nehru, bought the vision of the modern world because the romance with modern progress kept hitting the dispossession, environmental destruction, and mass alienation necessary for modernity to thrive. Anti-colonial thinkers fell in love not with the material aspects of modernization, but with the Enlightenment values, and spoke in good faith about ending poverty through modern development. Artists worldwide were equally attracted to the promises of modernity in art. Universality and individual subjectivity, the emancipatory potential of the avant-garde, the human decentering of the image, pure opticality. On her key essay, When Was Modernism in Indian Art?, Geeta Kapoor defines modernism in post-colonial cultures as crisscrossing with the Western mainstream. This was due to essentialisms pervading peripheral visions that were deemed culture-specific and therefore opposed to the universal, maintaining the center-periphery division. This was why modernity and the periphery meant precisely to resist using categories from ancient civilizations or thinking in anthropological terms. Kapoor, moreover, defines modernity as a way of relating to the material and cultural worlds in the face of massive life world changes brought about by modernization. Modernity in India therefore meant an ontological quest imbued with particular forms of reflexivity and struggles, producing a cultural dynamic in which questions of autonomy, subalternity, identity, authenticity, and tradition came to the fore. Paradoxically, only authentic cultures were granted nationhood, although national identity was pitted against the avant-garde. This is why, for Kapoor, Indian artists only became fully modern in the postmodern era, once they became able to confront the new without flying to the defense of tradition. In the postmodern, realism becomes the reverse mirror of the modern, and folk or popular art becomes a heritage that can stand for, even usurp, the vanguard forms of the modern. Kapoor also argues that modernism is a commitment to collective social change and to figuring subjectivity as a locus of potential consciousness, a site which is traversed and vexed by colonial and post-colonial identity ambivalence. The search for a modern authentic being in the face of post-coloniality posits identity not simply as a rational individuating project within the utopian plenitude of romantic community. It involves reclaiming the lost ground in history to colonization, where the self may recognize itself in the form of a collectively emancipated subject recovered from the plundering of its culture and historical memory. In this context, a debate emerges on how to politicize one's otherness. A subaltern demanding recognition, or for example, through the postmodernist understanding of the operations of power in relationship to how the cultural production of minorities, like feminists and Blacks, had been inevitably positioned within modern institutions. Modern artworks are thus committed to a subjectivity prefigured in a utopian sense of impending transformation, in tandem with modern society, which is moving toward a higher democratic stage. In Latin America, modernity meant a post-colonial national identity created through hybridization of originary and European cultures.
Irmgard, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we don't see your slides.
Oh. There, do you see them?
No, can you share your screen?
Okay. Do you see them now?
Yes, great.
Okay.
Thank you. I was so intrigued by what you were saying. I
Mhm.
didn't realize you weren't showing slides.
Okay. There we go. So let me catch up.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So anthropophagia in Brazil or mestizaje in Mexico. This process gave way to new subjectivities. And in Mexico, the main question posed by modernity was how to insert originary populations in the Mexican nation state. This political and intellectual inquiry translated to different ways of conceiving originary peoples, ranging from excessive contempt to absolute admiration. Modernity therefore meant to civilize through the colonist humanist reason, together with policies and cultural practices to lift originary populations out of underdevelopment by way of cultural ethnocide while celebrating national cultural diversity. In modernist art, Mexican nationalist identity was grounded on the glorified and reified pre-Hispanic past, which was pitted against cosmopolite or universalist subjectivities. Differently than in India, Mexican subjectivity in modern art is never that of the subaltern. If art is to be politicized, it is so through a kind of third cinema subjectivity, which means taking the enunciative position of a modernized universalist subject, denouncing underdevelopment, authoritarianism, exploitation, or lamenting cynically or melancholically the failed promises of modernity. The transformation of the modern international industrialized world order into global open markets, finance and global trade, the weakening of the working class, and the culturalization of social struggles are all hallmarks of neoliberalism that altered the very meaning of development and progress. These elements eventually laid the basis for a new form of integrating geographies and societies. As developed enclaves for privileged populations in the former Third World, and third world misery belts within the first. The new social and spatial arrangements are creating differential territorial sovereignties and vulnerabilities. In the context of global neoliberal democracies, politicization in art has meant visibilizing the collateral damage of globalization in a globalized culture industry. In our Latin American societies, the rule is the state of exception, a situation that we are being unable to signify collectively and thus manifests through an epidemic of disappearance, gender violence, and mass murder. The historical political frameworks that we are working with to understand violences in our countries are armed conflict in Colombia and war against drugs in Mexico. Relentless violences have created the need for spaces to mourn and to attest to the horror together. In Mexican and Colombian contemporary art, there is a niche linked to a politics of memory. An example of this aesthetics is Vaporización by Teresa Margolles, amongst others of her works. Margolles' main concern is to give form and denounce forced disappearance and violence lived daily in Mexico, derived from the war against drugs. She creates dispositives that give way to visual, sensorial, or physical contact between the viewer and the traces of violence. There is also Doris Salcedo in Colombia, whose work in general embraces the challenge to commemorate the victims of violence without spectacularization. Their works have in common that they are not narrative in the sense of giving directly voice to the testimony of the victims. Their source material is usually the remains of violent scenes or the imprint of the traces of victimization, mourning, or catharsis on the artworks. The logic of abstraction or conceptualization that generates their works finds an atavism in the Catholic relic that operates transcending representation through transference by way of contact. Like in the Shroud of Turin, which bears the traces of Christ's martyrdom in Doris Salcedo's Fragmentos, victims of gender violence imprinted their pain directly by hammering these plates, made with molten weapons handed in by the FARC at the time of the peace accord. Each plate carries the burden of a personal fracture, the traces of mourning and of a witnessing a ritual. These plates are embedded in a modern structure built inside the ruins of a colonial house. Salcedo conceived it as a space for dialogue, commemoration, mourning, and hope. Margolles and Salcedo's artworks relics have the goal to facilitate the transformation of violence into pain to create new realities for the mourners. In this manner, in Mexico, as in Colombia, collective and public mourning have become a form of social consciousness. According to Don Paley, the violences lived in Mexico and Colombia obey the passage of the Cold War to what she calls neoliberal war. The transition occurred when the Soviet bloc began to collapse, replacing yesteryear's communists with today's narcos. It must be mentioned that the Plan Colombia, put into place in 2000, consisted in militarizing the country with US subsidy, along with a list of ambitious reforms in all areas of public life. The peace process, fiscal and economical reform, democratization, development, juridical reform, and efforts to counter drug trafficking. The same model was applied in Mexico through the Mérida Initiative, tying neoliberal economic political reforms to militarized reinforcement against drug trafficking. In truth, however, the military aspect of both plans functions as counterinsurgency. For Paley, the war against drugs is an excuse to place violence at the service of the consolidation and expansion of capitalist accumulation. In this context, the sacralization of the traces of violence is making ruins begin to look more and more the same. Beyond the possibility of the autonomy of art subsidized by neoliberal repressive governments, an ideological rouse is revealed. That of the false promise of the erasure of historical contingencies of the disaster to which these artworks relics attest to, normalizing or whitewashing the cause of the catastrophe, which is extractivist neoliberalism. Cultural industries are supposedly antagonistic to hegemonic narratives and not ideological. The collectivization of mourning, however, is obscuring the pedagogy of colonial and neo-colonial violence that is generating wounded political subjectivities, impotent on their own and necessarily subject to recognition, restitution, and state intervention. The figure of the victim, after all, is the easiest and most trivial form of a non-threatening and threatening alterity, the new subaltern. For their part, spectators are in happy consciousness, drawing out a necrological mirror to confirm these miserable identities. The new reign of the politically correct of Latin American conservative sensibility is the passage from porno miseria to conceptual or minimalist commiseration. This is how cultural infrastructure is maintaining its role as counterinsurgency, privatizing collectible deals as settler institutions. Miguel Ventura's 50-minute video, Mexican Warfare, is set in an imaginary future in 2060, in which NILC, or New Interterritorial Language Committee, has taken over all of the American continent, creating a homogeneous territory grounded on racial and linguistic mestizaje and military repression as the grounds for social integration. The video documents the archaeological finding of footage dating from the beginning of the 21st century. The footage depicts the early integration efforts of the Great NILC Consortium, showing a performance in Frontera de Corozal, a village in the Guatemala-Mexican border. Two bureaucrats visit the town to put in action their regime's integration strategies, inviting the inhabitants to visit an Indian house, to hand out NILC chocolate bars, and to ask them to watch a ritual in which a chair is dunked in liquid chocolate. We get the feeling that the chair is sacred, and we learn that it has been imported from Marfa and created by Donald Judd. We also know from the video that the chair and the chocolate captivate villagers, enabling racial and linguistic differences to disappear, giving way to a new race of men and a world free of racism and socioeconomic inequality. In this fragment of Mexican Warfare, Ventura draws a kind of primal scene of colonization using an icon of art history and chocolate. Now remember Hershey's tropical bars in Korea and Vietnam, as lures to modernize before the aftermath, which is land expropriation and the commodification of life. We must note that in the ritual, Judd's chair is Dunkin' chocolate to be made to be reborn as Black. As we know, neoliberal extractivist capitalism, or empire, to use a vintage word, has been able to co-opt anything to legitimize itself, including discourses and practices of diversity, equality, and inclusion. Paradoxically, as I mentioned at the beginning, artists, thinkers, creators of emancipatory languages have willingly participated in building these modern worlds. Yet in Mexican warfare, it is clear that to be a modern artist is to serve the machine, and that even institutions that embrace diversity, like the Ventura's Indian House, are complicit in maintaining colonial violence. Ventura's video is reminiscent of Jean Rouge's classic Moi en Noir, a docu-fiction shot in 1950s Trècheville in the Ivory Coast in Africa. The camera mostly follows two villagers who have migrated to the modern city, Eddie Constantine and Robinson. We see them struggling to feed themselves in their daily routine. At the same time, they dream of being able one day to move to the modern neighborhood of Meseta. Their hopes and efforts to become modern translate to their attempts to insert themselves into the local cheap labor market, and by consuming leisure, such as attending box matches or going to bars with European or American names, or to the movies. In Mexican warfare, as in Moi en Noir, unveil the main element inherent to the primal scene of modernity, libidinal investment in becoming modern. In Rouge, the lure is the world that is promised by Hollywood films. What Jean-François Lyotard argued about the becoming working class of peasants and unemployed, without a doubt, applies to colonized subjectivities, for whom the process of modernization was apparently joyful. Lyotard wrote, quote, "They enjoyed the mass destruction of their organic body, which was indeed imposed on them. They enjoyed the decomposition of their personal identity, the identity of the peasant tradition that had constructed for them. They enjoyed the dissolution of their families and villages," end of quote. The end of Mexican warfare takes place in the fiction's present, 2060. We see the fully modernized future of Frontera de Corosal's inhabitants, happily cheering for Nilk's regime amongst the ruins of the modernized periphery they inhabit. In the video, Ventura takes a step further than Rouge. His gross parody of globalization and the culture industry's complicity with neocolonialism, put on equal grounds as militarization, brings on its head the possibility of even of decolonial art. The film ends with Nilk's counter-revolutionaries burning Muac down. In the becoming Black of the world, the libidinal investment and jouissance of modernization are gone, as is the belief in Enlightenment values. What remain are pathologies derived from unhealthy libidos, such as addiction, self-destruction, and sheer rage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irmgard, for your presentation. I'm interested to know more about this idea of the politicization of otherness that you speak about. But first, I'd like to invite Jeannine and Janus to come to the screen together. Great, thank you. So we have some questions, but from the attendees. But first, I'll kind of start thinking through this panel and how these three talks really coalesce. That's one of the things I find so stimulating about your three talks. I think there's many ways in which they overlap. And so Janus, you take us on this journey by leading us through your research into the lives of individuals and forgotten histories, investigatory explorations that ultimately reveal the excision of queer and female histories from official narratives. And Jeannine, you also narrate a local history, but you take the Ring of Fire as protagonist. That is, you treat this subject from the position of a geological nexus rather than through the subjectivity of the two artists, which I really appreciated. And I think Irmgard's talk picks up on some of these threads addressed by Jeannine, especially regarding the impact of neoliberal extractivism and instrumentalization of cultural identity as commodity, by looking at the specific context of how this exploitation unfolds in Mexico and Colombia. You propose that one of the many consequences of this extractivist neoliberalism is what you call the co-optation or whitewashing of catastrophe. And so with that, I wanted to start with a question for the group. I wanted to start by pausing on this idea of traces, whether corporeal or archival. Jeannine addresses this through the contaminated blood sample or the blood prick as a piece of evidence, an object through which or around which a story could be told. Janus looks for traces of the chairman in the archive, and Irmgard considers the remains of violent scenes in the work of Margolles and Salcedo as a type of relic. And so I wanted to ask, if we think about the trace as a sign that something has existed or something has happened, can a trace only be just that, a trace, when we know the local context? So bringing it back to the topic of this panel. So what does a prick of blood become outside of Fukushima? What does a court file signify when it is not housed in the Estonian regional holdings? And what is the water used to wash corpses when it is no longer in the Mexican morgue? So in other words, my question is, how can we recognize a trace if we don't speak, in a metaphorical sense, the local dialect? And anyone can, I know it's a big question, but it's very open. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I can start.
Great.
I think that Margolles and Salcedo recurred to this relic aesthetics, if we can call it that, based on the trace as a form of non-figurative art or non-representational art. And this abstraction has enabled their work to circulate in the global culture industry, no? As in this like globalized language of conceptualism and minimal art. And so I think if they were to be representative or narrative, or Margolles sometimes has witnesses on her pieces, no? But it's not the main component of her work. So using the traces of violence as source material in their works, on the one hand, makes that the traces of violence become generic and they could be from anywhere in the world. And this is coherent in the sense that modern violence reproduces itself across the globe, no? And erasing the specificity also erases the nationhood attachment. And I think that's what makes their artworks more attractive to the global context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I might try to jump in here on that question of trace and the global context and its legibility that Irmgard just brought up too. To the immediate question of what does it mean to have like a trace outside of blood, outside Fukushima? I think one of the things that's really interesting for Tita and Erwan are to actually share stories with other people, other communities who have shared experiences of living along the Pacific Plate. You know, so a lot of these traces are gathered to facilitate the sharing of story across countries, across experiences. And on the one hand, some of these traces are used for very pragmatic reasons, like they go to NGOs. NGOs will take those traces and use them for campaigns around climate change and climate disaster locally. But on the other hand, they're very protective about their autonomy as artists at the same time. And so these traces are also strategic. They're there for them to build a work, you know, and so that's something that interests me, that like, you know, people might be working against climate disaster, but they're also fully functioning as artists at the same time, wanting to make their own quixotic decisions around that. And so what that means in terms of legibility is that there's always a process of translation. You know, a lot of times their lectures are given in a language that aren't always the ones that the artists speak. They're being live translated. So, when they were performing in Yokohama, their lectures had to be live translated into Japan, and as somebody who is Singaporean, and does not have Bahasa Indonesia, there's also a process of translation and things that I will always inevitably miss. But that's not to say that those lapses and elisions don't actually also happen within the artistic process. This sort of multi-continental project, relies upon that. And so that's why I think the sort of use of story rather than history with like a big H, is I think important for this particular project. Because there's a certain kind of creative license that the artists allow themselves and also allow their spectators as a result. Step back here.
Maybe I didn't exactly understand the question, but thinking of traces, I think it's sometimes as telling is the missing of trace, and especially I think in working with gay histories, I see it quite often that relatives, when somebody dies, then let's destroy everything because of the shameful, because of the shame. And so I think in some cases I have, like in the showcase, these objects are fake, and I reproduce these traces, let's say. And I think it's also telling that you don't have it, but then what you do, and then it's you just make these traces up, and it's also work in a different way, but almost as good as the original. I think it's also one side of it.
Yeah, and what Jeannine says about the trace as a way to share a story, and Irwan and Tita's practice, I think that I was also thinking about that a lot, which you raised in your talk about sharing a chairman's tale at the Venice Biennial. And I really liked how you went into this, the challenge. I think you touched upon the challenge of exhibiting and telling this very, very particular story that has such a specific context that you had done so much work to research in an international forum, right? So I guess we can think about also the traces as in that context of what Jeannine says of sharing a story with this wider audience. I'm also interested in going back to this question of translation, because I think it also, then we can go back to like the work of someone like Margolles, who does not, from what I understand, I've never heard her speak in English in a talk. There's always translation taking place. And I think, that has something to do also with this really interesting way in which her work is represented so internationally and does kind of take on this like global presentation, but she's always speaking in Spanish. So another question for the group that I wanted to go into was this idea, and it's related to the previous one, but this idea of the visibilization that you each raise in your talks. And Jeannine delves into that both in the artist's self-presentation. You say, whether as, I love when you talk about Irwan as this charismatic mega environmentalist, or Tita in this urban guise. And Giannis self-reflexively asks, when you're sharing the history of the chairman, whether certain personal histories or subcultural identities shouldn't be shared. I like that you shared with us even that was a question you had in doing this project. And Irmgard leads us through a number of social movements in Latin America, including Ni Una Menos, that publicize private pain through the act of condolence. And so with this in mind, I would like to invite you to comment further on this idea of hypervisibility of those in subordinate positions, a hypervisibility that is constantly being reproduced in the contemporary art world. And so in the many interesting projects that you discuss, are those, my question is, are those who are in positions of power or privilege reciprocally invited to perceive or reflect on their own position to the same extent as those who have been oppressed? And so if not, does this reinforce ideas of the local as the provincial, as the peripheral, and the international as the quote unquote center. So in some, I know, again, that's a big question, but I'm wondering if this hyper visibility of the local or of those in subordinate positions risks reiterating notions of otherness.
Okay. I think it has to do, if we trace the genealogy of subjectivity in modernity and how it has expressed in art, which was what sort of like the colon of my talk. This is why I talked about the example of modernity in India, you know, which had the modern universal position pitted against the subaltern position, and the subaltern position was very much tied to tradition and to and to what was considered to be anthropological views. And only Indian subjectivity comes after this hybridization in which the modern can coexist with the traditional without being threatened. And this is sort of where Latin American subjectivity in art takes up, you know, from this universal point of view in which the reconciliation between tradition and the modern is accomplished. And what remains of this universalized cosmopolite subjectivity is to denounce or to melancholically or cynically the incompletedness of modernity or its failed promises, no? And one aspect of the subaltern universality in India means to politicized otherness, which comes now in the figure of the victim of state violence in Latin America, no? And maybe it is an overseeing of, or maybe alterity. It may not be that alterity is everywhere, but I think that the modern universalist subject is untenable at this moment for many reasons that we all know very well. And this is why we're seeing this politicization of subalternity everywhere. But what I found interesting and important about Miguel Ventura's work is that he's playing not with the cosmopolite universalist subjectivity, but the artist becomes an active agent of empire. You know, he's wearing a like a military costume, and he has you know, the gold medal, the narco gold medal. So he's making a lot of money, and he's handing out the chocolate bars, you know, the lure for colonization. So I think this is sort of a panning of the figures that we can see in art.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that interesting question, Madeline. You know, it was something that was on my mind when writing this talk. You know, wanting to make sure that Tita and Erwan didn't come across as, you know, pure environmentalists in any way, or primitivized, you know, village artists in any way, given the sort of communal sort of locality, the collaboration with indigenous fishermen, you know, that is in their practice, you know. And I think it's actually also important to recognize them as a generation of artists who've had more international opportunities to show and make work than some earlier generations of artists. And so for me, there was definitely an investment in being able to make some of that visible, and the ambitions of the artists as they coincide with very real local considerations around the climate crisis in Jakarta. And so to that question of hypervisibility, it's also on my mind that, you know, the next documenta is going to be curated by their peers, you know, and there is going to be visibility in a way there hasn't been internationally, globally, around a few generations of Indonesian-born artists in the next couple of years. And I think it's important to also recognize that, you know, even within these generations, there are very many different strands of practice. And, you know, Tita and Erwan, there's like anarchist strains in some of like the mutual aid, as well as, you know, the sort of traditions of gotong royong that animate their strategies as well. While also participating in the kind of like romanticism that some of their predecessors employed to great artistic success, like Radin Saleh. So thank you for that question. It was just something that was definitely on my mind around how to right around the visibility of artists who are not yet that visible, but very likely might be in the upcoming years, and how they would be perceived as a result.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and for Giannis, I mean, I'm interested in this, hearing more about this question that you asked yourself and deciding to make visible this story of the chairman.
Yes, I mean, it's, it was an important question for me, and I think there is no one answer to these cases. I think every case is different, and every time time to time you should ask how far to go in a way. But I was maybe convinced by the fact that these people who shared his story with me thought it is important to be told. Let's say it's not only about archives. It started from meeting his friends who told me different, stories about this person, and but at the same time, I mean, I left quite a lot of out when I felt that it would go too far, or many people are still alive that would bring them to it, which is not their interest and wasn't mine as well, even though some parts were also very interesting and would have kind of maybe make the story more, even add some layers, but in one point you just have to make some decisions, even though sometimes you kind of feel sad that you can't. But yeah, I think these are the ethical questions are very, very important if you work with recent history.
Yeah, thank you. And Giannis, I wanted to continue with the question just for you, if you don't mind. But I wanted to hear more about what I mentioned earlier after your talk, is this confluence of archival documents, facsimile recreation, and reenactment in your practice, specifically in A Chairman's Tale. So I'm really curious to hear how you see this role of the original, quote unquote, again, the original, the archival document with reproduction and reenactment, and what this interaction produces in terms of narrating local history.
Yeah, I mean, I love original documents and artifacts and objects. It's very important for me. And I was happy when, for example, the last exhibition, Coifs, I could show the original things. But with the German case, of course, it was much different, because also the need of hiding personal data. So, for example, the court case, which I reproduced, it's all the names have changed, or the places have changed, but also, I mean, translating in general is changing basically everything. So this was, I think, the first idea behind showing the court case. For me, there was no kind of question about it to show. I mean, of course, the questions if I could have had at first place the original, but also, or mainly because of the personal data, and the photos as well. They are kind of hidden, but the photos, in a way, they are kind of original, and yet not. For example, the illustration of the kolkhozes or collective farms, they are not these kolkhozes where he was working to, again, kind of mix the traces.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And for Jeannine, I wanted to ask you more about how you describe how the artists execute the Ring of Fire as a slow method of journey. And so I was reminded, I'm sure this will not sound unfamiliar to you, but I was reminded of another form of slowness that is so often discussed today in the context of environmental crises, which is slow violence, which Rob Nixon uses to describe the attritional danger of climate change, toxic drift, oil spills, et cetera. So is the Ring of Fire project, my question is the Ring of Fire project enacting a kind of counter slowness? Could we think about it like that? And I'm wondering how you see this slowness that the artists enact in comparison with sensationalist global climate activism that we, that's what we mostly see in the media.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, counter slowness is a wonderful concept. You should definitely write a theory about that, and I'll send it. I think it's a really interesting one because the Ring of Fire, because it's a 10-year project. So the artists set out with the intention that they're going to spend 10 years, you know, tracking life along the plate. You know, and so I think there's already a commitment to a certain time scale, and the slowness for them is actually really in that time scale of like being able to like unfold experiences and stories and collaborations with people over like a solid stretch, but also to allow conversations to unfold in the time that they need to unfold. And so I think there's a sort of resistance to a kind of extractivism by the researcher, you know, who jumps in and insists that the community like gives it up on your time rather than their time, you know. So I think some of that slowness is also a gesture of respect for the people that they would be visiting during their travels and their commitments to also like looping back. And so I think that slowness also produces a kind of body of material that is extremely unspectacular. You know, I think you're really right that the sort of like climate sublime, you know, like a little bit of that appears in their work. Like in the lecture performance, you'd see like the giant volcanic, you know, explosions, the clouds from Krakatoa, you know, but that really comprises one rather than like the sort of primary image. So what you actually get when you experience the works are a lot of slow conversations, a lot of like realist depictions, a lot of acts of demonstration. And so I think that sort of aesthetic kind of regime of like realism, slowness, small actions accumulated over time is definitely something that also combats the sort of very sensationalizing depictions of climate change that also make it feel as a spectator more impossible to actually get involved or make shifts. So I think some of that slowness that you're drawing attention to, you know, I think is really important for the practices, for the spectator's desire to even engage with the issue altogether. So thank you for bringing that up.
And will they definitively stop in 2024? Or if the project needs more time? I don't know if you know the answer to that question, but I'm curious if like it's 10 years and they'll stop, or if it, you know, can unfold and expand.
That's a question I have not asked them yet, partly because the last time we spoke, you know, they're still navigating what it meant to pivot the project with COVID, you know, so, and travel restrictions. I don't think when they started the project, they were thinking that would be really hard to actually leave Jakarta for 2 years, you know, so it could well expand. I would definitely recommend checking back with them after Jakarta itself is a little more open to travel.
Thanks. And for Irmgard, I was really curious about the images you flipped through of Daniela Rosell, Joshua Con, Santiago Sierra, when you explained the politicization of art in Mexico as taking place through the artist in a position of a modernized universalist subject who denounces. And so I'd just love to hear you speak more specifically about how you see Rosell, Con, or Sierra, one or more of those artists directly engaging with this quote unquote culturalization of social struggles that you so perceptively, how you put it.
No, I think that the erosion's apart. By the culturalization of politics, I mean this passage that took place in the 60s in politics, getting rid of the political party and constructing or recurring to other identities different than the worker identity for politicization. No, this is when African, you know, the Black Panthers, feminists, the war against Vietnam and so on. And this is when, you know, by the culturalization of politics, I mean, basically the figure of the worker disappears and culture and politics become bound under globalization and begin to take place in semiotically, no, through the civilization and so on and so forth. And I think that that has nothing to do with Santiago Sierra, Joshua Con, and Daniela Rosell are doing. What they're doing in the, I showed their works because I wanted to highlight that passage from that discussion in modern Mexico between Mexican, you know, art tied to Mexican identity, as in the muralist in the 1930s and 40s, to the rejection of nationalism in the 50s and 60s by recurring to abstraction. And then artists, again, in the 60s and 70s and in the context of authoritarianism, go back to the streets, go back to everyday life. And this is very much what is taking up in the 1990s. No, you know, in the 80s, there is a huge comeback of the questions of identity at the eve of globalization. And from these debates emerge, again, you know, issues of identity and of course tied to modernity. So artists in the 1990s didn't want to think of themselves as being Mexican. They saw themselves as cosmopolite subjects. And the questions that they asked were that of, you know, what happened to modernity? Modernity is incomplete here in Mexico, and they wanted to visibilize and denounce that. So
yeah, it's really interesting you say that they, or explain, I hope I'm understanding you correctly, that they didn't want to be seen as specifically Mexican, but as more international. Because if we think, I don't know, if we think about a lot of the exhibitions that were, that those artists such as Rosell were exhibited in, they were very much based around the idea of Mexican art, framing her within not a context so much of international art, but we have like numerous ones like Mexico Inside Out, these like definitely that take them within the specific context of Mexico. So I think it's interesting to think about that juxtaposition of the exhibition history and how they were presenting themselves.
Right. Yeah, that's the interesting part. No, they didn't want to make Mexican, quote unquote, Mexican work, yet the work became international as Mexican work, and everybody totally capitalized on that. Yeah.
So
let me add a footnote to that, because I think anywhere else, I mean, just in Mexico, we started to feel, sense, and live through the collateral damage of neoliberalization, and that became a component of contemporary art. And this was unseen in the rest of the world. And I think that, for example, Santiago Sierra's work announced, you know, the becoming third world of Europe with massive migration and so on and so forth, which when his work started to be shown in Europe 20 years ago, that was something that was pertinent to Mexico, not to Europe. And now it happens in Europe, you know?
Yeah. Thank you. So we have a question. I'll turn to some questions from our attendees. We actually have one from Rianne Lozano de la Pola, who will be writing, I mentioned she'll be writing a response on post. And she says, this is for everyone. She says, hi, everyone. Thank you for these 3 great presentations. I have a question trying to extend on the idea of traces and politics of position. What is the place in these local stories, in these situated ways of telling history or histories of fabulation? I'm thinking in Saadia Hartman's proposal of critical fabulation as a way to respond to archives, as a way to talk back to history in order to imagine that which can't be verified. So summing up this idea of critical fabulation and what that place is in your presentations or the works you talked about. Maybe we can, I think it's an interesting point, especially thinking about the creation of, again, going back to like storytelling and thinking about these ways of creating narratives, and maybe even like what we see in Janus and this kind of like tension between historical research and also like reenactment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's completely okay tool, or like, yeah, I've used it myself. This kind of like if kind of letting yourself free in one point of the real events, and then just to start kind of using your fantasy, because I think the idea is to get closer to the truth, or whatever it means, and sometimes you don't have enough, let's say, evidence, and then it's okay to play around with facts in a way you feel free, you like it basically. It's just I think it should be honest or clear for everybody else as well that you're kind of interpreting quite freely. Definitely, I mean, can't show the videos, but the videos were based on the facts, but we were letting us go in a way with the flow what we thought would be also just we weren't making like documentaries, let's say.
That's a great question, Marianne. I think that it is about how you read the traces, and the way in which you read the traces is the political position, no? Sorry.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Like, there's a politics to how one chooses to interpret and read. And when I think about the Saidiya Hartman's notion of fabulation, I also think about that concept in its context, you know, where there's so many gaps and absences in historical archives of slavery that she, as a writer, you know, is reluctant to sort of give voice to the slave because that's actually not repairable. That's actually not something you can actually do. And so it's something I feel like that's been important for me in reading the Hartman is her idea also of critical fabulation, but also narrative restraint, to not fill in the gaps that can't be filled in, to not provide narrative closure, even if that is more satisfying to a spectator or a reader, you know, that there are certain kinds of noise that you allow into the text as part of that fabulation, you know. And so for me, in trying to learn from that concept, it's to also recognize the things that I will never be able to prove. You know, I think as a historian, sometimes it's really tempting to sort of like follow the artist's tracks, you know, and sort of, I mean, I do that as someone who's a bit of a formalist on some days, you know, but I will never be able to travel the amount that Tita and Selena travel to be able to follow their tracks. So there's a lot that I actually have to sort of take on trust. Even fact checking a work like this is like unimaginable in some ways, you know. And so something that I think about in terms of like what Irmgard just said of like the politics of how you interpret these traces, I look for the behavior of the story rather than the veracity of the truth. You know, I sort of ask myself, how is this story unfolding? What are its tropes? What are its behaviors? And what are the demands made of me as a storyteller? And as a storyteller who's also situated as someone who is from Singapore teaching in a US institution that the artists are also fully conscious of, you know, and to also allow for that reflexivity in their practice to hopefully try to come through. But
yeah, and to add this, I think this is like one of the strongest tools that artists have, but academics cannot allow to make up or to kind of use their imagination, but this is where artists and can do this in a way. It's I think it's just something that academics and artists should work together, both kind of have their own tools and skills.
Yeah, I love all that. I really like this, Jeannine, you said behavior of story rather than the veracity of truth. I think that's really nice. Following up on that, another question from an audience member for Jeannine. They say, thank you so much for sharing your thorough and thoughtful research. I wonder if you could speculate on how this research project on Erwin and Tita's work might relate or not to your work on queer and trans history. I'm very curious to hear about what draws you to these different areas of research. Thank you.
Yeah, I do have an interest in storytelling as a kind of genre. And so I think that project on queer and trans history focuses on artists who make legends, but also what it might mean as a historian to write through the legend as a narrative genre that has some realist tropes to it. They often have some kind of basis in some person that existed at some point, but there's a lot that's unverifiable and speculative that you also have to work through. And so I think personally, one of the things that really attracted me to Tita and Erwan's work and Ring of Fire specifically is how it actually brings together two kinds of stories that you don't often see told at the same time, you know, and one is a story on climate change and the other is a story on institutional critique. They found ways in their work to actually pull the two together. And so that I'll just say is compelling to me when artists find ways to align forms that typically aren't alignable by narrative constructions, by your discourses and disciplines. That is really interesting to me when people take that sort of leap in their practice. They're also hilarious. So I did put the YouTube link in the chat and I definitely recommend it for anyone who wants a really compelling, but also extremely hilarious hour of watching a lecture performance.
Thank you. And for Irmgard, we have a question for you that says, thank you so much for your presentation. I particularly appreciated your engagement with Kapoor. In your research, do you often borrow from or engage with knowledge produced in other contexts and localities? And how does this practice nuance or figure into your own research and thinking? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. Yes, and I love Indian thinkers because I feel that we have a lot of similarities to processes of modernization in Mexico. We have a caste system as well. And so to me, it is also always very mind-opening to read Hindi writers like Gita Kapoor, but also Arundhati Roy, and so on. And yeah, I don't know. I like to learn from everyone and from everything, and it doesn't matter the location. No, see, if I'm in Brazil, I like read Brazilian literature and read Brazilian thinkers and so on. And this is how much I work transversally, and this is how my thinking works. My Tyranny of Common Sense book has Mexico as a case study, but making a lot of analogies to socioeconomic processes happening across the world as well. So, for example, similarities between what's going on in Mexico and the Palestinian occupied territories, or Brazil, and so on and so forth. So yeah.
And will that, in your forthcoming book, Toxic Loves, Impossible Futures, Feminist Lives as Resistance, I know that's part of a critical Mexican studies series, but I'm wondering if you also implement this transversal approach in that book.
Yeah, well, that book is sort of an homage to my constellation of feminist thinkers. So I have like winks and addresses and quotes and references and engage with the thinking of, you know, for thinkers for like Simone Weil, Lauren Berlant, but also Mexican feminists like Marta Lama, Sueli Rolnik from Brazil, and so on. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm very excited for that book. I can't wait.
And of course, in the title, there's a wink to Sara Ahmed, you know.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And also I wanted to, if the three of you have questions for each other, please feel free to jump in too. I don't need to be dominating the questions. So just interrupt me at any point.
But I actually was wondering something for Janus, actually. I was just thinking about whenever one draws upon a particular history, there's something often in the present that history is actively responding to. And so I was wondering if you would be able to or want to speak to, I think, what is queer presentness around which your projects are responding or not?
Maybe can you rephrase what is queer presentness?
Yeah,
what do you mean by this?
Like, how do you understand, what is like the sort of like almost like present context, of conversations around sexuality, material culture, the decorative, in recent years, that also made, your turning back to archives in this particular way, what's going on in sexual culture now, or given these projects that you showed, some of them happened like some years ago. Could you just speak to like what, those histories were working alongside as they appeared in the present for you?
Yeah, I mean, I started with these projects because I felt a lack of talks about what happened before, and almost like I think one must be careful of telling what is Soviet and what not, but maybe we can say that in Soviet Union there was a lack of sexuality. It was not something never talked about, let's say. And I think this we inherited in a way from our parents and so on. Then again, it was interesting to see what happened in 90s when everything kind of became free and you can talk about everything, and you open a newspaper from end of 80s or beginning of 90s and there was like invitations for sex parties and like kind of explosion happened. And everybody were so curious. But when this kind of stabilized, then the conservative kind of came back and we said, yeah, this is wrong. And then I think the new wave in this queer movement came that, or like I feel sometimes politics say that it's something from West, that it kind of came with EU and so on. So yeah, definitely I felt need to start this conversation. I wasn't the only one, of course. But I think at the moment we can see there have been some studies that the tolerance has kind of gone better and so on. And yeah, there are more and more people who work on these topics. So it's interesting at the moment here, I think, to see the process, but also I'm following what is happening in other neighboring countries. So we've organized some conferences together with other Eastern or Europe, Western Eastern Europe, or even post-Soviet countries, maybe.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeannine, for that great question. That's a good point. And we actually had one from an audience member, Giannis, which you touched upon, about if you have similar research finding throughout the Baltics. So it's interesting that you mentioned that you find these kind of like interconnected across those borders in this region that you're working. We only have about 5 minutes left. And again, if any of you have questions, yeah.
I'd like to ask a question to Jeannine.
Yeah.
There were hints at this in your talk, but I wanted to ask you to tease out more the relationship between, I feel that Indonesia is the place where the effects of climate change are being felt more and are more present than anywhere else in the world in particular. And I wanted to ask you to tease out the relationship between this condition, environmental condition in Indonesia, and the visual history of Orientalism in their work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. In terms of like the visual history so the question was on like the sort of urgency of climate crisis in Indonesia relative to the visual history of that depiction in their work.
Of Orientalism.
Of Orientalism in their work. Ah, yes. Okay, so there isn't a huge amount of focus on Orientalism, but where it does show up is around Erwan's fascination with Raden Saleh as like a kind of artistic ancestor. And so in the Southeast Asian context, Raden Saleh is a huge artist, like really a sort of founding father of modern art and modern painting in so many ways, and so I think there have been a a lot of, there was, a few large surveys already done, and so they also take up what it meant for him as a sort of self-styled Javanese prince to be working and showing in Europe as well. So this is a tradition that the artists definitely call upon for the way that they are therefore perceived by the rest of the world very reflexively. So that's like one place the Orientalism shows up and is explicitly named as Orientalism. Another place in which I think Orientalism shows up, but it might not be a way they would talk about it, is a way in which a sort of Indonesian-born artist might be read or appear as a kind of like native primitive, sort of peasant villager. And I feel like that is something that in the way they present themselves in performances is often sort of something that's worked against. I sort of notice it. There's always like a MacBook or a laptop, there's a suit and a jacket, and it's all very ironic and sort of canny in that presentation. And so I think about that as a way to sort of deflect, I think some of that kind of external gaze that I think is smart and often wield it to a very humorous and parodic effect. They don't just sort of like adopt it, right? Like they sort of always call attention to the fact that this is a full performance in the sort of lecture performances that they do. So that's a great question. I feel like you can't look at the work without also seeing that reflexive layer between yourself as a spectator and the artist. But I also was really curious about your new book, Irmgard, and the title. And I was excited to hear that you were also thinking of it as a kind of wink to Sarah Ahmed. And some of the toxicity in her work relates to institutional relations, right? And the institutionalization of racism. And so I was just really curious about like, what is the ground for toxicity? Because like in your talk, you mentioned extractivism, but I also feel like, there was a sort of institutional critique, of the contemporary artist that you were also kind of perhaps mounting. So I was just curious about like, what is the landscape of toxicity you're addressing in your work?
It plays out more in the personal level. And, activists across Latin America now are drawing a direct link between extractivist violence to the earth and the women and violence against women, gendered violence. And so I entered a discussion by talking about one's internal violence and what do we do with what do I do with my violence, and how that is part of an ecosystem of toxic relationships around everything and everyone. And I also, I think about how, for example, bullying in schools, and I'm thinking of about my daughter, reflects on, violences at the national, at other scales. So I try to draw the links between all of this, like environmental destruction and pollution and epidemics of addiction also, and and pathologies of self-destruction. And so I try to draw like the whole picture of it, in which bodies, territories, subjectivities, affects are all intermingled, and it's all toxic. No, so it's also a sort of a healing journey, putting things in their place and so on. So yeah.
Oh, I really appreciate hearing that, especially in a moment where toxicity is talked about exactly in the ways that you're identifying, in a chemical kind of way, but also in affective, interpersonal kinds of ways. Like that word is used so much more in art spaces as a workplace modality, for instance. So that's really great to hear, like that, your new work is traversing and linking all of these spheres.
Thanks. And also, in the section where I talk about cultural production, I come up with this term toxic empathy, linking to Leslie Jameson and Susan Sontag and this genealogy of thinkers about empathy today and empathy in modernity and so on. And the condition of modernity that is looking at the pain of others, according to Susan Sontag. So where are we at today? Thinking also about Elvia Wilke's novel Oval, based in Berlin and so on. So yeah, it's all over the place. Sorry.
Not sorry at all. Sounds great.
It's 11:01. I'm so sorry to stop the conversation because I really love the way it's unfolding. I love these conversations taking place between everyone. Unfortunately, I want to be conscious of everyone's time. So we'll come to a close, but I really hope we can find other platforms to speak, and hopefully in person would be even better. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Jeannine, Irmgard, Janus. I'm just really love this panel. I'm so inspired. I can't wait to keep following your work and hear more about these projects that you discussed. And I also want to thank our audience members for joining us for the 4 sessions of Transversal Orientations. We hope you have all enjoyed the program. Just a final reminder that the recordings of these will all be available on post.moma.org in the coming weeks. And in July, we'll also publish the text by our respondents. So that's all we have today. Thank you for staying with us to the closing of this. And I look forward to being in touch. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.